On the second day of the conference, we are so delighted and honored to host a prominent political scientist, Joan Tronto. Joan Tronto is a professor emerita of political science at the University of New York and the University of Minnesota. Educated at Oberlin College and Princeton University, she is the author of many works on care ethics, including over 50 articles and several books such as Moral Boundaries, A Political Argument for an Ethics of Care, Caring Democracy, Markets, Equality and Justice. Okay, now I try. Le risque ou la care, translated by Fabienne Brugère, and Who Cares? How to Reshape a Democratic Politics. Her work has been translated in 10 languages. Unfortunately, Turkish is not one of them yet. So throughout her career, Tronto has taught various graduate and undergraduate courses in political theory, feminist political theory, women in Western political thought, democracy, and citizenship, among others. Tronto is the recipient of many awards, such as the Scholar of the College from the College of Liberal Arts in the University of Minnesota, the Brown Medal for Democracy, Honorary Doctorate from the University of Humanistic Studies, the first annual Okin Young Prize for Best Published Article in Feminist Political Theory, and the Fulbright Senior Lecture Award in Bologna, Italy. Professor Tronto is among the leading scholars of the field of care ethics, and her work has widely influenced those working on care ethics and politics from a non-essentializing perspective, as also described by Inge van Nistelrooy in the previous session. Her widely cited book, Moral Boundaries, has been a key influence to scholars for locating care in a feminist, politically contextualized perspective and acknowledging multiple inequalities and power relations associated with care. Toronto's specific way of locating care as a central practice that should inform democratic institutions and relations make her work all the more critical today when more people have realized, hopefully, how central care is to human lives and political orders. In this book and in her other work as well, Tronto refers to the privileged irresponsibility of those who do not have to think about care on an immediate basis and hence tend to degrade or ignore activities of care. A concept I think we would all agree were reminded several times in the past year while reading and talking about the pandemic and how it reinforced gendered and other forms of inequalities. I want to make a note about translation here. There are several different words in Turkish that correspond to different elements of care, such as caring about, caring for, to take care of. Hence, there is no single translation of care ethics in Turkish. I will now say a few words in Turkish. It has been translated as bakım etiği, ilgi etiği, özen etiği, ihtimam etiği. Among, these are the ones at least I know. For the purposes of convenience, we used in the titles and the program bakım etiği and özen etiği. And interpreters will sometimes use them interchangeably or use one in accordance with the context. Before I give the floor to Joan, I must say I'm personally honored and extremely excited to introduce her, as Joan has been my PhD advisor at the CUNY Graduate Center and has had deep influence in my work, but also my personal journey as a political theorist. I must say that her work directly speaks to her actions and all the moral elements of care she enlists in her work, such as attentiveness, responsibility, competence, responsiveness, apply to her relations with her students and advisees, whom she guides with care, patience, and utmost encouragement, sometimes believing in your work more than you do and encouraging you to speak and write louder. Thank you, Joan, for accepting our invitation to deliver this speech. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gülru. I want to begin by thanking the Gender and Women's Studies Center at Sabancı University for organizing this conference and for inviting me to participate in it. I especially want to thank Gülru for inviting me to participate, and Begum for her administrative support. And I want to thank the technical people who make this possible, who are behind the scenes doing important work, and the translators who will have to keep up with this New Yorker for making this visit possible. So, we seem to live in a world that is beset by serious crises. The climate crisis, which literally threatens our existence not only as a species, but as a life-sustaining planet. The demographic crisis, which threatens to wipe out or transform humans as a species through the age imbalances of rich and poor countries. The global pandemic of the coronavirus, whose harms have not yet reached their widest point. The ongoing threats of military violence, which could destroy the world as we know it. The violence of everyday life. The threats of mass starvation. Now, the dream that these crises will somehow be resolved by technological fixes, filling outer space with shields to keep out the sun's heat, for example, or pumping carbon dioxide into the ground, or for that matter, robots who will care for us, lures people into a false and passive form of denial. Surely, as in the superhero movies, something or someone more powerful than we will show up at the last minute and avert the crisis. But such fixes only exist in the movies. The only real possibility to deal with these crises, global democratic action, is also in a state of crisis. While the news is replete with scenes of protest against bad rulers, most people in the world are, as they often are quite disengaged from political life. Surveys show that around the world, people are much less committed to the idea of democratic life than they once were. And no wonder, because being a democratic citizen means taking on responsibilities, being knowledgeable, and making one's judgments that may run contrary to one's desires and even to one's own needs. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to begin by talking about a way of trying to frame the current crises more broadly as a crisis about care. And what I'm going to do is to argue that we need a clear vision of the overarching harm against which we must all react. And here I will call it wealth care. And then we need a realistic, actionable, democratic strategy to overcome this harm. So the purpose of this talk is to outline such an account of the present dangers and to offer a way to resolve it. And I'm going to divide the paper into these 4 sections, start by talking about Wealthcare Defined, then talk about the way in which wealth care fosters anti-democratic and unjust care, and then talk about the promise of caring democracy as an alternative. So let's start with the first section, wealth care. I'm inspired to use this term by an essay written by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who wrote an essay called The Importance of What We Care About. And the title says it all, doesn't it? We care about some things and we don't care about others. And if we want to know who we are, morally, politically, in every way, we need to think about what it is that we care about. And what we care about in the modern world is wealth. I define wealth care as a set of values that posit that the growth of wealth is the central value, activity, and purpose of society. Society's reward should go to those who create and grow wealth. Now, in some ways, to refer to wealth care, what are you doing? Why can't we just use our already existing words like neoliberalism or capitalism? But I think to say it's about wealth care is a different way to put it, because it gets us to focus on the fact that this isn't only about economic life, but all of life being turned into and directed towards the economic. So wealth care exists and it shapes the political economy. In a longer version of this work, which I'm working on, I would talk about how economic sectors of growth have been distorted by the concern about wealth, how the profit motive underpins everything, And I would talk about the examples of the financial sector, the military sector, the cycles of creating foods which make people sick and then having to cure them of the illnesses that those foods create, the exploitation of the natural world, and so on. All of this suggests that wealth is at the heart of what we do. Now, I don't want to say, I would never say that we don't need wealth or that wealth is a bad thing per se. But what is bad is the unlimited pursuit of wealth to the exclusion of all other values. Now, we move on to the second part. Wealthcare functions primarily for the wealthy. It depends upon passing one's wealth on to one's heirs. And in this regard, it is familistic in a very deep way. It focuses on the state and creates the conditions for maximizing wealth by turning the state to its purposes. And it mythologizes freedom as a free market, as Karl Polanyi had already told us back in 1944. Wealthcare pulls the entire economy in its direction. We may think that the economy is about meeting needs, but it's increasingly about meeting the needs of the wealthy to produce greater amounts of wealth. In a book published already in 2010 called Oligarchy, Jeffrey Winters talked about what he called the income defense industry, in which he argued that in addition to the very wealthy, there is also a whole cadre of people who make up the upper echelons of every society, whose job it is to protect wealth. So these are the people who do the bookkeeping, write the laws, make sure that the international financial system works to the advantage of those who are already wealthy. And this also is the reason why the financial sector has continued to grow in the countries around the world. And think about it for a moment, to use the economist terms, in terms of the opportunity costs. When bright people are drawn to do accounting rather than, say, medicine or environmental science. Now, people who have written about neoliberalism have already given us many critiques of important parts of this wealth care system: precarity, speed up. But what they haven't done is focused on the way in which, while most people work for a living, they are completely excluded from wealth care. And even if we talk about trying to equalize income, we're not talking about it if we're not talking about wealth care. Now, wealth care also benefits from the pervasive forms of racist and other forms of inequality. You'll forgive me if I primarily draw my examples from the United States, not because I think it's the most important example, but it's because it's the example I know best. In the US, there's a racial wealth gap that for every dollar a typical white household has, a Black one has 12 cents. Think about that. 12 cents instead of $1. Or for Latinos, 21 cents instead of $1. And these gaps are growing. People with wealth, furthermore, attribute their success to their own individual action and qualities, not to their historical advantage. And it also follows that they think people who don't have wealth don't have it because they're lazy or have done something wrong. But remember, most wealth is accumulated wealth. It's been inherited. It hasn't been earned. And so an extraordinary amount of disingenuous behavior makes people think that they are succeeding on their own when they aren't. And finally, the wealthy have no interest in disturbing this pattern or disrupting it. So the fact that there are so few people of color with wealth doesn't matter to them. It works out to their advantage. So this brings us to the second point. Wealth care is a system that fosters anti-democratic and unjust forms of care. It's in the nature of wealth care to make anti-democratic and unjust forms of care continue in the world. Wealth care magnifies wealth over time. It requires that wealth is passed on to heirs. And so over time, the effects of unequal wealth grow greater. Now, over time, it also happens that because these imbalances exist, wealth inequality comes to appear natural. And wealth then creates opportunities to extract wealth everywhere, including from the public sector. One of the most disturbing things I've read lately is about the way in which the bail system in the United States works through the exploitation of the mothers of people who have been arrested. So everyone knows the criminal justice system is broken. So when someone is arrested, the bail bondsman goes to this young man usually and says, "What's your mother's phone number?" And then he calls up the mother and says, "Look, do you want your kid to stay in jail? You know that's not going to be good for him. So you should take out a bail bond, and then we can get your kid out of jail and he'll be better off." They charge exorbitant interests. They rely upon using the mother's need to care for her own child as a way of extracting this money from them. And it's, these are really poor people. They end up taking out loans that last for years in order to get their son out of jail for a few months. But this is the way in which you can now extract some more wealth out of the really poor people. And this extraction of wealth is happening everywhere on every level in society. Wealth care harms care because protecting wealth happens at the cost of public investment in systems of care. So since we don't invest, but leave the money in the hands of the wealthy, this already harms the nature of care. But it harms the nature in two specific places even more. Let's think for a moment about care through the market and care in the family. Care through the market is engaged through hands-on care, which is too expensive to generate wealth. So it is always shortchanged. Let me say this again. Because care is so expensive, it costs time. There's no way to cut time out of care. There's no way to make it more efficient. If an older person needs to go to the bathroom 5 times a day, you can't do that all at once. You have to be there at 5 different times of the day to help that person. And so as a result, care is very expensive unless you exploit the caregivers to make sure they don't get, for example, their full wages. And in a book written in 2017, Lydia Hayes points out that even despite all the laws in England to protect the workers, those workers are always still exploited. Second, what is marketized is care for the wealthy. Their desires outweigh other people's needs. So if you've read Arlie Hochschild's work, she talks at length about the ways in which there are personal trainers and personal shoppers and at big corporations, you can leave your dry cleaning in the morning and pick it up in the afternoon. But all of this works to help and meet the needs of the wealthy who already are in pretty good shape. And what it doesn't do is look at the ways in which the needs of the relatively less well-off people are completely overlooked. And they're the workers doing this work 24/7 overtime in order to meet the whims and desires of those who are relatively wealthy. So in the market, care, paying attention to wealth has the effect of being bad care. Furthermore, care that's left outside the market, left in the private sphere in the family, has increasingly become extremely precarious. In the US and throughout the higher income countries, family structures are actually changing under conditions of non-wealth and precarity. Now, even in China this week, there were reports that although China has lifted the one-child policy and even the two-child policy and says you can now have 3 children, many young Chinese families say, we can't afford to have children because it's too expensive. What does it mean when it's too expensive for people to have children? right? And marriage in the United States even is beginning to disappear among most people. Only the well-to-do are marrying now. Other people are living together, because to marry is basically to consolidate two people's debts, and not, in fact, to do better. Children, furthermore, are beginning to be used in the language of investment, and even sociologists have started to say, we need to think of children in terms of what kind of an investment do they represent. So both market care and family care produce and sustain injustices. Because if the goal is greater wealth, then good care involves maintaining, preserving, and protecting wealth. This can only be done by making certain that others don't have the same resources and opportunities that you do. So anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic, and in-group focus become the way to think about what it means to care. You want your kids to have an advantage over other kids. So do you want all the schools to be equally good? No, you want the schools where your kids go to school to be better than the schools where those other kids go. And this kind of competition has the effect of ingraining and deepening inequalities. So the political and intellectual clout of wealth also grows. Politically, it's been established over and over again that elites and business interests are able to affect political outcomes, whereas citizens don't. And this study by Gillens and Page was done in the United States, but a similar pattern exists everywhere. In a recent book about the way law operates, Pistor writes that laws and institutions are shaped to protect wealth. This doesn't surprise us. But most importantly is the work that Nancy McLean has done in her book, Democracy in Chains, published in 2017. She points out the ways in which wealth care is deeply anti-democratic. And when you think about it for 2 seconds, it makes sense, right? Wealth care benefits a small number of people. Their primary interest is to make sure that others' needs and interests are not fully represented and expressed. Thus, it's no surprise that their way of looking at the world is fundamentally anti-democratic. What they want to do is make sure that the measure of everything, people come to think of themselves as producers and workers and consumers and lose their ability to think of themselves as citizens. Starting in the 1970s, a group of economists decided to talk about public choice as the way to understand how economic patterns of decisions should be made by government. And Nancy McLean quotes the starters of these people saying this: the public choice revolution rings the death knell of the political we. It's a nice way to put it, isn't it? Rings the death knell of the political we. We just don't even want to talk about the fact that people as a collective have some interests which are separable from their private economic interests. Just for a second, let me make the point that wealth care completely warped the response to the pandemic. Wealth has grown exponentially during the pandemic. Rich people have made a fortune in the last year and a half. I mean, it's just they're more billionaires now than there were. The billionaires have all become much wealthier. And at the same time, as this was happening, in wealthy countries around the world, think of the US especially, there wasn't enough personal protective equipment for nurses to go to work without having to take plastic garbage bags and wrap themselves in it. Now, how can that be? It's not that we didn't know. There have been studies that have gone back for 20 years that show that there wasn't enough personal protective equipment in storage. But somehow that problem didn't get fixed, while billionaires have made millions and billions in this process. In an essay that, it's not an essay, in a webpage, a broadcast, Dr. Prasad issued what Smith calls Prasad's law, which is The investment in healthcare comes at the points where there is wealth to be made in healthcare. So if you invent a new stent for a heart procedure, that will get funded. But if you want to pay to have more nurses on the floor, that will not get funded because it doesn't produce wealth. One of the examples of this that really stands out to me is what happened with ventilators. You may remember at the beginning of the pandemic in the US, there was a great deal of fear that the US would actually run out of ventilating machines. It turns out that about 5 years ago, the US federal government had given a grant to a small company to develop ventilators that were cheaper and easier to use. But that company was bought by one of the larger ventilator companies. It killed the project. Because if these smaller, better machines existed, their big, expensive ventilators wouldn't be bought. And so rather than compete, they just decided to make sure they never got built. They never got built. And had they, the world would be a better place. But it's not the logic of wealth. That would be the logic of health. On the global level, too, this pandemic has had an enormously bad effect based on wealth. Jesse Bump, writing in the British Medical Journal earlier this year in January, wrote that the COVID-19 political economy is extractive, repressive, and competitive. The burden of COVID-19 follows extraction patterns dating from colonial times, with the worst outcomes suffered by marginalized people and poorer countries. In 2020, global poverty rose for the first time since 1990. And as we all know, it's not everybody in the global South who's harmed by this. Women and lower class people have been disproportionately affected around the world. So wealth care in this case has also had these bad effects. Finally, wealth care redefines and limits responsibilities. I wouldn't think of speaking without quoting Hannah Arendt at least once. You all heard from Linda Zerilli yesterday at much greater length. But in Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt made this really sobering observation. She said, tribalism and racism are the very realistic, if very destructive ways of establishing this predicament, of escaping this predicament of common responsibility. Once we realize what we owe to one another, it's very, very difficult to take on that burden. And so we're much more likely to retreat to a kind of tribalism or racism. And wealth lets us do that. It's also parallel to what Sheldon Wolin has called managed democracy in his book, Democracy Incorporated. But it was Karl Polanyi back in 1944 in The Great Transformation who I think made this point most wisely. He said, freedom started with economic activity and ended with being able to cast aside all forms of compulsion on the part of a state. Once you believe in the free market, you believe that responsibility for, quote, economic suffering in society is not your responsibility. It's somebody else's, unless you directly benefited. Polanyi continued, indeed, such a person came to view himself as outside of politics and economically produced structures of inequality, and, quote, he denied their reality in the name of his freedom, unquote. That last phrase, he denied their reality in the name of his freedom, helps us to understand what has been going on with people who refuse to wear masks, who say, I'm not getting vaccinated, who say this pandemic is just a hoax. Because after all, why not deny that responsibility rather than have to limit your own freedom as you understand it, meaning I can do anything I want. Indeed, wealth care also helps us to understand the phenomenon of neoliberal populism. And this is a point that was made well by my friend and colleague, Wendy Brown, in her new book. She points out that the rise of anti-democratic forces is largely because that neoliberal policies fail people in their daily lives. And as a result of this failure, they become anti-democratic, looking for some solution to the problems they now face. Now, right-wing neo-populists can be thought of as racist or as distrustful of outsiders, as masculinist, and they are all those things. But another way to understand them is to see that they are defending their way of caring. If they think they've been abandoned by the state, they think that they are completely justified in saying, I must protect my own. And so if that means being anti-immigrant, anti-poor, you name whoever is marginalized, that's what I must do. And it's not because they hate the others, it's because they think that's the only way for them to protect themselves. So how do you undo such false populism? You have to call people out on it, of course, but you also have to rethink the logic of wealth care. You have to create the conditions for universal and pluralized, genuine capacities for care. Because as long as people are in situations of precarity, it's very difficult for them to imagine an alternative possibility. The psychology of wealth care, after all, means that people are told to focus on their own wealth. But of course, only a few will ever be wealthy. The point of wealth care is to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. And so it is never going to be the case that wealth care will produce enough wealth for everyone. This breeds ignorance, fear, and resentment on the part of people who are without wealth and don't know how to get it. They're fearful of the precarity in which they find themselves, and they're resentful of anybody they think is getting off better than they are. The end result is what I've previously called, and Gulru kindly referred to it in her introduction, privileged irresponsibility. People who are relatively well off think they owe nothing to others. They disregard those who are left with care duties and think that they are the only ones whose views of the world matter. So this is a pretty bleak picture of the world, but it is, I think, an accurate picture of the world in which we're living. The way to fix it is to think about care democratically. So let's do that. I want to begin with a much more general philosophical point about care and the nature of limits. Look, the real problem of wealth care isn't wealth, because we do need wealth. It's good to have more resources in the world than fewer. But it's the fact that wealth presumes that there are no limits to the level of wealth that certain individuals should achieve, or how much we should exploit the natural environment, and so on. What we learn by acting in caring ways is how to understand the limits of care. To participate in relations of care is to recognize that we are both caregivers and care receivers throughout our lifetime. And recognizing that we are also always care receivers, that we are always in relations of care with others, is a way for us to begin to establish that there are some limits to how far care can go. Margaret Walker called this an ethics of responsibility, and she put it this way: an ethics of responsibility as a normative view would try to put people and responsibilities in the right places with respect to each other. Persuading people to give up wealth care requires us to recognize that we have work to do. Look, the wealthy are not going to give up on wealth care. They think it's the right way for the world to be organized because it works for them. But what the rest of us have to do is to talk about the ways in which wealth care is anti-democratic, and how can we use the democratic power of the majority to transform those ideas. So what we need to do is to talk about the ways in which wealth care is an injustice in itself. It's not that it has some hidden relationship to injustice. It is itself the source of injustice. That To care well under wealth care is, as I suggested a while ago, an unjust way to care. And then to ask people to think about the question, how can that be the right thing to do? How can it ever be correct to try to live in a life where you get all the benefits and other people suffer? So if we're going to challenge wealth care, then we need to do so by thinking about a feminist future beyond wealth care. And that's what Caring Democracy does politically. Before I say that, I should point out that more radical change in the economy is clearly possible. And many proposals exist for ways to make the economy more caring. Already 10 years ago or so, Cristina Carrasco Bengoya wrote an essay in Spanish called, I'll loosely translate it, Care is the Backbone of a New Economy. And people have been talking about a caring economy now for 10 years. But in the last year, partly, in fact, right before the pandemic began, a whole series of new scholarship began to emerge that looks at care as the basis of an economy. Oxfam published a report called Time to Care in 2020. UN Women, in their annual review of the progress of the world's women, emphasized rethinking care and paying for care as the basis of this. A group of scholars in the German-speaking world have written a thing called Care Makes Better, Cleanup Time, Redesigning Care After Corona. The Women's Budget Group in the UK has issued a commission on gender equal economy, creating a caring economy. And the Care Collective in the UK also published a book called Care Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence last September. So there is no shortage of very specific ideas about how to transform the political economy to make it more caring. But a care economy also requires a care politics. And so the question is, what matters more, economic growth and wealth growth or care? Is the purpose of care simply to serve as infrastructure for the economy, or is it important in itself? And this is the reason why, although I greatly respect Marxist feminists who talk about social reproduction, I don't like to use that language because social reproduction still says it's secondary to production, which is the first and starting point. No, care should be the center, and we should organize the economy around care. And the way to do this is for us to think politically about politically about caring democracy. The great democratic revolution is incomplete because it leaves those who are still associated with the work of the household outside of full democratic participation. Just as think about the transformation of democracy from the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. Just as incorporating workers demanded a change in the scope of democratic concerns, so incorporating women and marginal people, usually in the household, also requires a transformation. And so, if you know my work, you know I argue that there are three main elements of democratic caring. First, we have to redefine democracy itself. Democracy should not be about how to manage the economy. It should be how to allocate caring responsibilities in a society in a just way. So this requires that we change our basic understanding of what politics is about. Second, we have to reorganize our care responsibilities. Some currently can avoid all care responsibilities or deflect them or pay others to do them and pay them poorly. So everyone needs to be made responsible for care. And thirdly, and this is really important, we need always to use democratic means to arrive at caring solutions. This is a challenge because care is not often about equality. Usually when we recognize that we need care, we're in a situation where we really need care. And we are in a position of relative powerlessness vis-a-vis the person who's caring for us. If you're in a hospital, you can't really say, doctor, here's how I think this should go. You really need to listen to what the doctor's going to say. But we need to think about the fact that although in any given care relationship, there may be inequality, the goal is over the lifetime and throughout society to create the conditions for equal care, equal opportunity to both care and be cared for. So how can citizens learn to practice care democratically? And how can all the voices of people be incorporated into caring this way? It means that we have to limit hierarchies wherever we can, make room for all voices, and be open to other people's understanding of their own needs and of whether or not our needs are being too broadly met. Only a broad democratic movement for change can undo wealth care. Anything short of that, and we'll end up with the wealthy still in power. It is possible to start from particular yet universal matters to see commonalities, even if we disagree about them. And this is the start of democratic citizens who can care for democracy. I mean, we could pick something simple and straightforward, like what should the school calendar and day look like? Should students go to school all year round or only for some periods of the year? Should their school day match the work day? And if it doesn't, what should change in order to make them line up? I mean, if we want children to be well cared for by their parents, then we have to make sure that their parents can do that. And if they're working at a time when the children are out of school, that doesn't make sense. I mean, even that very simple example makes clear that we would have very difficult decisions about how to organize the day. Do we recognize the weekend? Well, in Islamic countries, Friday is the day of rest. In other countries, Saturday is. In other countries, Sunday is. But throughout the world, it's mostly observed that Saturday and Sunday are the days in which businesses are closed. Why is that? That doesn't make any sense. And again, once citizens begin to fight about this, there are going to be disagreements. But it's coming to resolve those disagreements that shows people how to make democratic progress through resolving problems that really matter in their lives. You'll remember that Margaret Thatcher used the language that there is no alternative to neoliberal economics. But she was clearly wrong. There is an alternative, and that alternative is to put care, not economics, at the center. People working on this question of how we can undo or how we can make the world more caring have been making arguments that are really broad about this. For example, Diva Woodley in 2020 gave a wonderful talk about care and politics, in which she made the argument, which grows out of her work with the Black Lives Matter movement, in which she talks about the ways in which Black Lives Matter is a care movement. It's a movement about recognizing people's lives and saying that they matter. That's a claim about care, not a claim about economics. And building from that, we can begin to make much broader cares arguments. Caring democratically then sets the practices in motion by which we would, in all aspects of our lives, begin to rethink how much what we're doing is oriented towards the generation of wealth and how much of what we're doing is oriented towards care. Once we make this contrast clear, we begin to see that caring democracy and caring for every one of us well is the goal, not caring for wealth. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Joan, for this very, very rich talk. We already have some questions lined up. So as we also reminded on chat, and as I announced in the beginning, we will be taking questions on chat, and I will read out the questions so that the interpreters can translate. So the first question comes from Yeşim Arat. What happens if we are in an authoritarian state that doesn't allow us to use democratic means to arrive at caring solutions?
That's a very hard question for me to answer sitting here, although not as far away as I might have once thought. It is still the case that the only thing that brings down authoritarian regimes is when people call them and challenge them. And that can happen in many ways. One of the things that's so interesting is that when authoritarian regimes are challenged, they sometimes disintegrate. Yeah. And we don't know when there is a proto-civil society that exists that's about to do this, but keeping constant pressure on the authoritarian regime is a way to make sure that they will sooner or later make mistakes, destroy the economy, expose how much it's only about cronyism. But people have to think that the alternative is going to somehow also be beneficial to them. And the only way to do that is to make sure that people understand that their fears are recognized, and that there is an opportunity coming for them to live their lives well.
Thank you. Another question from Mersa Ararat. I'm reading. I wonder whether Joan can share her views about why people are less likely to be involved in politics these days than, say, 60s, 70s, or 80s.
Okay, I have a couple of answers to that. One is from Albert Hirschman's wonderful work on public and private. And he makes the argument that there's kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth between involvement and non-involvement. People are involved up to the point where it seems not to have any good effect anymore, and then they stop being involved. In different places, we're in different places in this pendulum swing. In the US, I think right now, we're actually swinging back to greater involvement. And I think that's true in many places in the world right now, that people are seeing that being more involved will have some benefit. Sometimes it's a crisis that draws people back into the public sphere. And sometimes, and this is really kind of counterintuitive, some signals from government become a way to get people more involved. So the feminist movement in the United States was partly inspired by some very, it seems, small steps by the Supreme Court in, for example, deciding that women should be able to have their own credit cards in their own name rather than just their husband's name. But sometimes these things just crack the world open. My colleague, Frances Fox Piven at City University of New York, wrote a book called Poor People's Movements. And she pointed out that poor people are always with us, but sometimes poor people revolt. And she asked the question, when does that happen? And it happens, she said, when two things happen. One, there's a crack in the system. It looks like the rulers have lost their power or their influence or their direction. A crisis like people dying of a pandemic when they said they could take care of us is an example of a crack in the system. And second, it happens when people can point to a particular set of people as the ones who have brought this hardship upon them. And as long as people think it's natural that they're poor people, it's natural that we suffer, it's natural that whatever, they will not revolt. But it looks like those people did this. They're the ones who set up the rules so that the economy failed, or set up the rules so that public health was not possible. Then there's a possibility for people to revolt. Maybe that helps.
Thank you. I will read a question from Pelin, thanking you for a lot for this important talk. You mentioned how healthcare systems extract wealth out of poor people. We know from what we experienced during the pandemic in Turkey is that people working in the most precarious sectors, such as artists, freelance, irregular workers, the most vulnerable groups could survive through the crises only through the support and care of their family. The impact of family care in countries like Turkey, those with more family-centered cultures, has been somehow to buffer the impact of the crisis. It perhaps impeded the potential in the society to revolt against the crisis/system. Such care structures of care have remained largely invisible too. On the other hand, we know the potential of care in reproducing resistance, building community resilience, and surviving against exploitative extractive systems. And the question is how to find a balance, how to understand and visibilize care in a way that it does not play in the hands of the system, but works. I guess Pelin has reached the word limit here, so I can't see the rest of there it is. That it doesn't play in the hands of the system, but works for the resilience and sustainability of vulnerable communities. Could you elaborate on this with practical examples, maybe?
I think you have already in the question given a very, that's exactly right. Yeah. The family has served as a buffer and has protected, in a way, the state from some of this criticism and from the recognition. Yeah, it's a very hard balance because you don't want to criticize the family, but on the other hand, it's to say that it's too big a burden for families to take on is also true. And to recognize the ways in which families have to take on these extra burdens, have stepped up, that's a good thing, but it's also a sign that it's too much. And to point out that it's too much, that there would be other ways to organize it. When you have concrete examples of other ways to organize is important. It's useful to think of families on two levels, right? And that is that there are biological families that people have, but there are also families that are, if you will, intentional families or chosen families. And to point out that people often rely on these chosen families as much as the biological families. So to begin to break away the idea that only biological families, only those of us who are related to you can be your support, already begins to open up the possibility that there are other systems of support that are out there. And I think that's an important argument always to be making parallel to recognizing that the family does serve as a buffer. I guess the language to use is to denaturalize the family, to denaturalize the idea that only the family is a support for us is a way to raise these questions more broadly.
Thank you, Joan. I have a question here from Özlem Aslan. How can we go beyond seeing care as an intersubjective relation and expand democratic care towards our relation to nature?
Thank you, Özlem, for this question. It's a very difficult thing, but we should recognize that we are also in relations with other animals, plants, objects, places. Yes, and as soon as we recognize that, we see that those two are related. Now, many of those are not democratic relations, right? Or mostly are not democratic relations, although people like Bruno Latour have suggested the creation of a parliament of things in which the natural things and the human-made things even would have some political role in speaking. But short of that, we can't, we don't usually think in those terms. Recognizing that all relationships of care bring with them responsibilities is an important way for this expansion to begin to happen.
Thank you. Özlem, I will come to your second question later, okay? I'll address some other questions first. There's one from Simtan Joshar. As far as I could understand, Deva Woodley also brings in collective healing as an essential aspect of caring. How would you relate this as a strategy against the neoliberal emphasis on self-care, to which we are continuously called at different levels? And relatedly, any comments about the possible means to collectivize caring practices?
This is absolutely right, and I should have said it, that the part of what neoliberalism is about when it talks about care is self-care, either for the individual or for the family unit. And this idea of self-care, again, Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society, actually sounds like something that Karl Polanyi said. It's very important to recognize that care is always collective. It's never individual. None of us can take care of ourselves. All of us rely upon others all the time. And the more we can emphasize that and take it away from simply noticing that sometimes our care relations in the present system are exchange relations, right? You go to the restaurant and pay the people to fix the food for you. But you're still being cared for because you're still being fed. And the question is, how do we get people to recognize that that is also a form of care, although it's not the best way to do it necessarily, or the only way to do it.
There's a question from Aslı Aygüneş. In this framework of wealth care, where can we locate understandings and practices of care work in civil society, maybe specifically embodied and performed by volunteers? How will their work contribute or challenge wealth care?
Oh, it certainly does, because civil society exists outside of, doesn't exist outside of, but exists in some ways as a challenge to the idea that the only thing that exists is the political economy. So insofar as volunteering in civil society creates another space, a third space outside of the family, outside of the economy, if you will, outside of the natural world, outside of the economic world, civil society stands as a challenge to wealth care. But you'll notice how it is, for the most part, increasingly undermined by the very ways in which it's organized. So increasingly civil society organizations model themselves on economic enterprises. And that's a dangerous way for them to think of themselves. There's no way to get them to stop doing that, but it would be better if they didn't do it. Volunteering is, yeah, you're quite right, outside of wealth care, except it sometimes, again, this is, okay, it begins to get very complicated. Some civil society organizations, what we know about, for example, charity, or is that people give to organizations that match their place in society. So wealthy people give to the art museum, poor people give to their local church or local religious group, right? And so just to say, well, all volunteering is beneficial, in some ways reinscribes certain ways in which the wealth care system functions. So it's not enough to say all forms of volunteering are essential for undermining wealth care. To some extent, the fact that we get called into volunteering already makes us part of the wealth care system. My colleague at City University of New York, Jan Popendieck, wrote a book a long time ago called Sweet Charity, in which she looked at food banks as a form of charity. And she pointed out that while, of course, people love to give food to poor people, it would be much nicer if poor people actually just had enough money to buy the food they wanted themselves, rather than having us give them a can of beans today. it makes us feel better, and in a way it takes away some of our guilt, but it doesn't necessarily make it better. So volunteering is both beneficial and challenges the welfare system. In other ways, it continues to support the welfare system. There's a phrase that I ran across in an article from the journal Ethics back in 1938, by an article by W.O. Brown. He was talking about racism, but it's a more general claim. He says, a rationalization is an inoculation against insight. And things like certain forms of volunteering are inoculations against insight. They let us think, well, we don't have to worry about people without food because food for the hungry exists or Oxfam exists. So that problem's been solved. And that's the danger of relying too much on civil society rather than thinking more politically here. Thank you for these questions. They're really wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Joan. Another Aslı İkizoğlu Erensu has a question. Thanking you. Aslı says, tomorrow we'll have a panel on transnational feminism. Relatedly, I was wondering what Professor Tronto thinks about transnationalizing democratic caring. I'd love to hear her thoughts on expanding geographies of responsibility.
Yeah. That's a really important question. How do we expand geographies of responsibility? The first thing that we have to do is get people to recognize that they have responsibilities that are historical. Because I think the historical responsibilities are the ones which quickly become transnational. Look, the entire world has been swept up in a system of colonial exploitation for the last 5 centuries or so. Let's just give it a rough estimate. But not everyone has been affected or affected the same people in the same way. And the idea for example, cosmopolitanism just to me seems not to go anywhere. Whereas, and this is, I think, what transnational feminists do more. And my colleague Fiona Robinson, of course, in Canada, has done a lot of work on care and transnational transformation. What we have to do is recognize that some of us owe particular debts to other particular countries in very particular ways. And it's out of those particular debts that we begin to understand what it is that we owe. For example, you probably know that in the international political economy of healthcare, nurses from the Philippines end up going all around the world providing healthcare, but also sometimes being trained as nurses, but providing domestic work in other parts of the world. Now, how did it happen that nurses in the Philippines, that nursing became such an industry in the Philippines? Well, it happened because the United States, private foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation decided back when the Philippines became a US protectorate after the Spanish-American War around 1900, set up nursing schools. And then gradually the government of the Philippines figured out, well, this is a way for us to generate some international hard currency by sending nurses abroad. But the initial impetus to create nursing schools in the Philippines per se was an American phenomenon. So does the United States owe a particular debt on those scores? Yes. Should feminists in the United States be more concerned about what happens in the international political economy of nursing because of this? Yes, they should. And so I think there's ways in which transnational feminism is absolutely critical. And it's also the case that we have to then trace back where these lines of obligation and responsibility lie and take a special responsibility for the ones that we are tied into. If that helps, I don't know, maybe it does.
Thank you so much. A question from Pinar Ensari. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking talk, I'm wondering what Tronto thinks about the relationship between care and masculinity. Although care work is mostly relegated to women, especially migrant men, increasingly participate in care work, which brings about the discussion regarding caring masculinity and its transformative potential for both men and the wider society. What are the different ways in which men's participation in care practice can be related to a caring democracy?
Well, of course, the idea that men don't care is an ideological construction, right? And men do care, and men engage in caring practices of all sorts. Often, though, they're caring practices which are shaped by other natures, other aspects of masculinity, which are not all that helpful. So, for example, men will often think of their role as protectors, as carers. And there's a relationship there, but there's also the danger that protection doesn't always serve the needs of the people who are being protected. So one way to do it is to just recognize that there are caring masculinities that already exist, and to talk to men about the ways in which they think about care. But men, like women, also share these same naturalized ideas that women are better carers, for example. I mean, in many of the higher income countries, as many men are doing caring for their elderly parents as are women, but they don't think of it as care, or they think, if only I had a sister, she'd be able to do this better. They think they can't do it very well. One of the things that would help to fix this, of course, would be for men to learn how to do care work, as opposed to being told that it's about, it's women's work, women's things, and they shouldn't touch it. There are global organizations now like Pro Mundo, which are trying to foster men doing greater caring work around the globe. And it's a really important movement, I think, for men to recognize this. And you're right, too, that it's not just women, but men, especially lower class men, who often do, especially the dirty work in care.
Thank you, Joan. So coming back to Özlem Aslan's second question, the notion of wealth care also makes us think that the multiple scales that take part in creating wealth care, from everyday life to global institutions, how do you see the relation between these scales?
It's very hard to go from one scale to the next. It always is, right? This is one of the difficulties of getting political life to operate. But recognizing that the same kinds of questions about who is responsible, who's doing the actual work, how are we being responsive to needs, how do we recognize what problems need attention in the first place, operate on all the levels that we need to think about care, recognizing that care is analytically similar, whether we're talking about care in a household or care for fixing a global pandemic. That, I think, is a way to begin to change the scale, is to get down to details and not to kind of recognize that, yeah, this is going to be hard to do. Okay, you're right, it is. But if we begin to focus on the dimensions of care, who's responsible, who's doing what, are the resources being made available? All those kinds of questions, which are, go back to the analysis that Berenice Fisher and I offered already in 1990. If we begin to focus on those pieces, then at every scale, we recognize that care has some essential qualities which are the same, and we can apply the lessons that we learned, say, in the household, to those at work, to those at operating at a regional level or a national level or a transnational level.
Thank you, John. I'll pose one other question from chat, then I have my own question.
Okay.
Melsa Ararat has a follow-up question. The first question was about why depoliticization happened in societies. So the follow-up question says, Joan's answer to my question was cross-sectional. I wonder if she can offer a historical perspective on the question of depoliticization across countries.
Well, the thing about history is each is unique, right? And so it's impossible for me to make judgments on a broader level than to say it will always be the case that in any given historical setting, there are forces which are moving towards depoliticization and forces which are moving towards politicization. And it's a question of trying to take advantage of those that move towards politicization. Those will always involve trying to make people see that it's in their interest to be involved. And interests here are so difficult to get people to recognize, right? People often think of their interests in very narrow terms, but we have to ask the question, who benefits from our narrow perspective of our own interests? Who benefits if we think of, politics is dirty business, it's not for me? Who benefits from that are the people who are left behind controlling the political world, who are, for the most part, as we've already established, those who are paying attention or pay other people to pay attention so that they can protect their wealth.
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions on chat, so maybe I can pose my own question. I'm wondering whether, you talked about how, you asked the question, how one learns to practice care democratically. And my question is whether you can name any maybe contemporary examples of a feminist or queer practices of care that you find inspiring, illuminating in terms of learning to practice care democratically. And in addition to that, I also know that in your work, you talk about some of the shortcomings and pitfalls of care and how it's also very much open to abuse, both in terms of the one who gives care and receives care. And we know that these can also happen in collective, communities, feminist or queer communities as well. So, I wonder whether you have any concrete examples, anything you find inspiring that where one learns to care democratically while avoiding these pitfalls that you mentioned in your work.
Yeah. So I have a couple of examples. I don't know if this will satisfy you, but a couple of examples. One, when I was living in Minnesota, there was a small town in the northern part of the state. Minnesota, like all parts of the United States, even though Minnesota is in the middle of the country, there are a lot of people from not there who live in Minnesota. And especially in small towns where there are industries like meat packing plants, there are lots of people who are from everywhere in the world. So a small city like, I can't remember the name of it, but it's the place where Spam is made. There are 100 languages spoken in that town of 20,000 people. So there was this little town called Pelican Falls, and there were increasing numbers of people who were speaking Spanish and people from North Africa, because there's a very large Somali refugee community, an Ethiopian refugee community in Minnesota. And so women in headscarves would be walking down the street in this small town. And there was beginning to be graffiti and violence against the children and so on. A couple of the people in the town said, this is not good. We have to do something about it. And one day, they just talked about it. And then one day, one of these women just stopped on the side of the road as she was driving down the road. She saw a woman walking and she said, where are you going? Maybe I can give you a ride. And the Somali woman jumped in her car and they went to the grocery store. And then she said, okay, you know what? I'm going to start bringing you to the grocery store every week. Just here's my phone number. I'm going to call you. Her friends were very angry with her because she was spending all of her time now with her Somali friends instead of with her. But over time, what they did is they decided they would start cooking meals for each other and expanding the community of who would be cooking meals. And then they realized that it wasn't enough for them to say, we have to care for them. Because if you do that, then you still stigmatize the people you're caring for, but that we all have to care for each other. So at the local library, they organized an exhibit about being a refugee and arriving someplace foreign. And they used the pictures of the people arriving at the airport from last year, but they also used the pictures from 100 years earlier, when the Norwegians who originally settled the area came by train, and what kinds of suitcases they carried and what kinds of things they brought with them. And so the fact that they were able to create a common experience was a way for them to begin to care together. The levels of violence went down, the levels of graffiti went down, and people in the town became more accepting of one another. It's very hard work, and it happens over time, and it happens among individuals. How do you keep it from becoming abusive? Well, there's no guarantee that it won't. There's no guarantee that democracy will work. I hate to say it, but it's true. There's no guarantee. The only way to make it less abusive is to create the conditions for democracy and make sure they're always present, so that you always are open to hearing people say a critical thing. Here's an example of it going wrongly. So when development groups were criticized in the Global South for coming in and saying gender was the most important thing, and they were going to try to help women to the exclusion of thinking of other issues, they were criticized for this, because not in every community is gender the most important thing. And what they did then was to develop questionnaires and do a needs assessment when they went to a community. Hi, we've brought our needs assessment questions now. Let me ask you these questions. Which are the most important questions for you? And they develop checklists and things like that. Okay, so that's a step forward, but it's not there yet, because you're still using your frame to decide what people's needs are. And letting people announce what and how they want their own needs met is probably the most difficult thing for caregivers to do, and the most essential thing for making care more democratic. Maybe that helps to answer your question.
It helps a lot. Well,
Okay.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thank you for this talk, for this amazing, vibrant discussion afterwards. I will keep on talking about some of these tomorrow as well. And we also had a lot of questions remaining from our panel before this on care ethics and practices. And maybe one more announcement, because I realized that in one of your slides, when you were giving examples of some of the contemporary work, you mentioned the Care Manifesto. And one of the authors of the Care Manifesto, Joe Littler, will also be speaking tomorrow on
wonderful.
transnational feminism, transnational feminist solidarity. So thank you again for accepting our invitation, and thank you everyone for coming here, joining us and asking wonderful questions. And once again, a big thank you goes to the interpreters, Ceylan Gürman, Işıl Demirakın, and Sungur Sabran, translating throughout the day very, very dense conversations and talks. Thank you again. Have a good evening and good day.